Hi everyone, and welcome to African Art Part 5. We are now going to look at the sculpture from Central Africa. So Central Africa, like I said, they're not quite sure how old the area is and civilization there, but they have found artifacts which they can date. So here is an ancestral figure honoring mother and child from the 19th century. It is 35 centimeters and it's carved wooden figure. It's from the area near Congo, previously known as Zaire. And the date is more recent, but wood would also not last centuries. So remember, when it comes to the artifacts, the material depends on how long that thing would last. It was not as developed as the rest of the world, and it was a repository for the soul of a noble deceased woman. So they basically did this in honor of somebody who had died. It was regarded as a powerful figure, and the tribal people would pray to her and offer her gifts. So, kind of like a symbolic figure of Jesus. People would pray towards that, to pray towards Jesus and to God, and offer gifts towards them. So, it's very typical of African carving because we've got geometric simplification, so symbolized shapes, not realistic. The head is enlarged, showing spirituality. The body is small and less important, and the baby symbolically offered. The brass decorations are geometric. Then if we look at a lot of figures that are found called power figures, these are also part of Central Africa, and they're also known as nkisi. These are carved out of wood and they are imbued, which means they're preyed upon and they are blessed with spiritual power by ritual specialists, so by your shaman. Your shaman would imbue the power into these figures. They use a variety of ingredients, including herbal medicines, animal parts, pieces of metal, fibers, and all of that is used to concentrate and to attract certain kinds of spiritual power. Sometimes horns, so actual animal horns, were added to intensify their strength. They were made to address specific issues. So if you were having a problem with your wife, they would have a certain mix of ingredients that they would put together for you. So each power figure would be specific towards what you needed. And some were for individuals and others were actually made for the entire community. African masks were played an important role in rituals and ceremonies, so they were not actually made as decorations. They were made as part of these ceremonies, as part of rituals. They were also sometimes used to frighten people away from secret meetings. So they were used as a deterrent for people to find out what these people were actually doing. They represent special spiritual ancestors. So the person wearing it would become the embodiment of that ancestor. Usually they would also be covered from head to toe. So they would be completely taking on the character of that mask. The Western world uses them as decoration. So when people come from overseas, they'll still buy masks and put them on their walls and think that it's cool because it's part of Africa. Where in Africa they would have had to have the mask accompanied with sound, smell, movement, costumes. It was a whole ritual that went around the masks. They were not just a wall hanging to make it look cool. Most masks are carved out of wood and decorated by engraving, burning, oiling, adding beads and shells, horns, and fibers. Again, if you go into the playlist, you'll see there's a nice video of somebody actually making a mask. This is the boom helmet. The boom in your textbook, I think it's a different name. Let me just check. It is incorrectly listed in your textbook. In your textbook, it says MBOOM, boom, where it's actually BWOM, boom helmet. And it's from the 19th century. It comes from Zaire, so again, your Congo area. It is 30 centimeters high, so the height of a ruler. It was carved to fit over the head. So there's a piece at the back that goes over your head like a helmet would. It's got a prominent forehead, so the forehead sticks out quite far, and it could represent primordial ancestors that would empower the initiation ceremony. So it could also be showing wisdom of that ancestor. The surface was overlaid with geometric patterns. So you can see things are simplified. We've got the triangles on the head, and the eyes are marked with bands of beads. So there's a band that goes all the way across the eyes. The beads delineate the nose, so they mark it out. Delineate means just highlight it. And the lips, so they highlight those two things. And the jawline has got beads and shells around it. The back is also decorated because, like I said, it's like a helmet. It wraps all the way around 360 degrees. Then we get this special kind of mask called a dimba, okay, which represents women, and it actually sits above the wearer's head. So it's not the traditional mask that goes in front of the head, it goes above. So it actually represents goodness and light, and it's a very positive image. And it encourages moms or mothers to have strength to bear and raise children. Usually it's used as weddings and Thanksgivings. It's a very heavy structure, so usually it would have been worn by men. And you can see in the picture here, it is a full costume, so you don't see the wearer at all. These pieces here would go over his shoulders, and his head would actually stick into the middle part here. Usually there would be holes between the boobs so that he could see out. And then he would be covered, and he would dance to emphasize hips and womanliness. So now I just want to do a quick comparison between the traditional African art and traditional Western art. So remember, this is more or less the same time period. Okay, some of it a little bit less, because now we're looking at Central Africa. So they're not as refined as maybe Ife and Benin. So let's look at the differences. So on the left here, we've got the ancestral figure without the date, because remember, we're not sure, and it's out of wood. On the right, we've got the Mona Lisa, which I'm sure you've seen before, made by Leonardo da Vinci in 1503, which was oil on wood. On the left, we have a function, so it's integrated, it's used actually in ceremonies and rituals, whereas the Mona Lisa was made for art purposes, just to look at, hang on the wall, look pretty. The traditional African, if it decays, another one can be made. It's not a train smash, whereas the Mona Lisa is the only one ever made. The African art is conceptual with simple and strong geometric shapes. It's not realistic. It is the message behind it that was important, not the execution. Whereas Mona Lisa would have been all about the execution, how natural it was. African art were given movements, they were danced with, they were carried. Okay, Mona Lisa was static, put on a wall, looked at. African art was never seen in isolation. It was part of a ritual, part of movements or drama. Western art was seen in isolation. Usually it's in a museum or gallery. Previously, the Mona Lisa would have been in a cathedral or palace. African art was made to be used, not to look at. Some of them weren't even seen by the rest of the tribe, but only by the elders. Where Western art is made to be looked at and to be thought about and discussed. African art is not preserved. Usually they use it for the ritual, they bury it, and then move on. It decays quickly and it's easily replaced. Whereas Western art is preserved, looked after, put in galleries and museums, and is meant to be preserved for future generations. Right, now you're going to do activity 2.4 on page 88. So this is going to be done in your theory book. So you're going to look at Mona Lisa. There's a close-up of her face there. And then you're going to be looking at the Benin Queen from the early 16th century in bronze. Both of these works were created in the 16th century. Write a short comparison between the two faces created at about the same time, but on different continents. Look at the facial features, the media and techniques, the style, and the meaning. If you want the answers, they are linked in the description for the video. Right, then we're going to look at artists that got influenced by this. So remember, initially, Africa was seen as very primitive, tribal. Nobody really looked towards Africa as art. But in the 20th century, African art started being recognized by people like Picasso. So if we look at Picasso's picture at the top here, you can see that the way he's painted using those lines make it look like scratches into wood. So scratches like on the masks. And even his color palette would have been towards African masks. Cecil Scottness is a South African artist who also used wood as a medium, which he then later started printing with, and he also looked towards Africa for his inspiration. Right, then we are now going to look at the Leidenberg heads. So the Leidenberg heads were a whole bunch of terracotta. So remember, terracotta means baked clay heads that were found at Leidenberg in South Africa. So carbon dating, so remember looking at the carbon-14 in the actual clay, dates them at 16th century. They were used in ceremonies. Many of them were broken and had to be reconstructed, and 2 of them were big enough to actually be worn over the head, whereas others of them look like they could be attached and still worn in a costume, like our, let me just find it, like our, these masks. Okay, so they have simple facial features and decorative patterns that were built out of clay. The large heads seem to have animal forms, so like this one would have been the larger one, and it has a little animal on top of the head. They have decorative bands which separate the hairline or make it stand out, and there are traces of speculite, which is a black metal. They can be seen in South Africa at the museum in Cape Town. Right, and then I want you to do activity 2.5, page 89 in your textbook. You're going to be looking at the Knock head and the Leidenberg heads, and you are going to compare them. You're going to look at the date, the material, the form, the eyes, the headdress, and the decorations, and see how they differ from each other.